Bismillah, alhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulillah, a'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. Man yahdihillahu fala mudilla la wa man yudhillu fala hadiya la. Wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika la wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join me tonight for this live stream. Bi'Iznillah, I'm going to try to keep this talk under an hour. So give or take 60 minutes. Bi'Iznillah, you'll be out of here before then. But if you're not able to stay for the entire hour, the talk is obviously being recorded on YouTube and it will be available for you later on, inshallah. So for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Noor Jude. I'm a member of the Muslim community circa 2015. I was born into a Muslim family and left the fold of Islam when I was about 18 years old, and then returned to Islam when I was about 28 years old, alhamdulillah. And since then, I've been doing a lot of work on the ground, a lot of grassroots work, and most recently, my husband and I moved to Allentown, Pennsylvania, after living in Northern Virginia for a couple of years. I'm originally from New York. And since coming out here during the COVID sort of pandemic, it's been a little bit difficult to connect with members of the community. So that's why I've been trying to take the time to do more online things. And this particular topic is a part of a 3-part mini-series about marriage, divorce, and life after the honeymoon phase. And this collection of topics is something that, and I know people say this all the time, but it's something that many, many folks in our community have lots of questions about, lots of issues about, and sisters in particular want to talk about this. And so I've been wanting to connect with fellow sisters regarding this matter for quite some time, but given how taboo it is and given how sensitive and delicate it is, I have not always felt the most comfortable or the most equipped to do so. And I still don't feel fully comfortable or fully equipped to do so, but with Allah's support, inshallah, and Allah's guidance, I'm going to do the very best that I can to touch upon an aspect of this topic and to hopefully offer some insight to fellow sisters, whether you are married and are deliberating divorce, or you are not married and just want to kind of educate yourself on the issue. Hopefully this conversation will just give you some more information. With that being said, I do have a few disclaimers to begin with. The first is that even though this video is going to address a taboo topic, I'm not addressing it simply because it's taboo. Like, I'm not interested in talking about this issue simply because it's a hot topic. It's not intended to be some sort of, like, I don't know, way to get people to, listen to what I have to say at all. In fact, as I mentioned, this is something that I have been avoiding talking about. But because divorce is on the rise in general, and also for Muslims as well, and because of the sheer number of sisters who feel the need to seek information on the matter, that is why I've decided to speak up about this. And whether or not you know, I was married once before, am divorced, and have remarried. So I have a little bit of experience as a divorcee. Now, what this video does seek to do is shed light on just one trend that is affecting the Muslim community as far as marriage and divorce is concerned. There are many, many reasons why couples end up getting divorced. I'm not interested in talking about all of those things, okay? Partly because I'm not equipped to do so, and partly because that is not necessarily beneficial. What I am interested in doing is talking about a very specific trend that didn't necessarily come out of the Muslim community, but it's something that bled into our community. And hopefully, by identifying this singular trend and taking caution, my hope is that fellow sisters will be able to arm themselves and protect their marriages from this destructive trend. What this video is not going to do, and I said this when I announced it, what this video is not going to do is presume in any way that I know anything about the fiqh of divorce. I know as much as any lay Muslim does, and if you are seeking scholarly advice regarding the fiqh of talaq, then I highly recommend that you seek the guidance of a trusted scholar. This video is also not intended to provide any particular couple any advice about their particular marriage. I do not want any sister walking away from this video thinking, oh, well, Noor said X, Y, and Z, and that applies to me, therefore I should get a divorce or I should not get a divorce. No. Okay. As we will see, the issue of divorce is extremely complicated, and in our deen, there are so many checks and balances along the way that are designed to be preventative measures before divorce actually does transpire. There is absolutely no way that you should take my advice or any one person's advice or message and use that as the be-all end-all for why you decide to stay in your marriage or not. So be wise and be careful. Okay, so now that the disclaimers are out the way, obviously this being a live stream on YouTube, I have no control over who's watching, but I am speaking primarily to sisters, and hopefully these are sisters who can then take this information back to their husbands or brothers or whomever if it's beneficial in that way. Specifically, I'm intending this video for sisters in my age group. That means those of us who are between ages 20 and 40. That doesn't mean that if you fall outside of that range that you're not welcome to listen to this live stream or that it's not going to be beneficial for you. It will, inshallah. But the reason I'm singling out the millennial group is because this is the group that is currently in its prime as far as marriage age goes, and oftentimes are the ones struggling to make the decision regarding the future of their marriages. Over the last 2 decades, it seems to me that many Muslims in the West have inadvertently ingested the same contaminated elixir, if you will, that our non-Muslim counterparts have been guzzling. And that is the trend that I want to talk about, and I will get to it shortly. Now that I have clarified, inshallah, the intention of this video, I'm going to go ahead and just let you know what the flow of the rest of the conversation is going to be. I'm going to talk about the very basic fundamentals of divorce in Islam without getting into the fiqh matters of it. And then we're going to look at a snapshot of divorce in the United States. Now, even though these statistics are more related to what's happening in the US, they are not that different from other Western nations. And you can do your own research to compare and contrast those numbers. From there, we'll talk about the impact of divorce on children. And then we'll get to the trend that I want to caution sisters about. And then finally, we'll do a quick recap before the Q&A, inshallah. If you have any questions, as always, you know where the live chat box is. Drop your questions in there. If I can get to them during the talk, I will. If not, inshallah, towards the end. Sometimes I have a hard time multitasking, so forgive me. Okay, so let's begin. Let's talk about the most fundamental things that we need to keep in mind regarding divorce as Muslims. We know, alhamdulillah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed divorce to be halal or permissible situations, which we're not going to discuss in this video because, again, it's outside the scope of this video. But what we do know is that unlike, let's say, Catholics, divorce is not considered a sin in Islam. It is not haram. Now, what we want to be careful of is not to take that to mean that because something is not haram or that it is halal, that means it is something that Allah loves or that Allah encourages us to do. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that the most hated of permissible things to Allah is divorce. So if you wanted to think about this in terms of a hierarchy of things that are, halal, divorce is at the bottom of that list. Allah has made divorce halal because it is a last resort option in certain social situations and in certain marriages. The Prophet alayhi salam also reminds us that Shaitan, a'udhu billah, places his throne over the water and he sends out his troops. And many of us know this famous hadith. The closest to Shaitan in his rank are the ones who cause the greatest tribulations among mankind. One of them returns to Shaitan and says, I have done this and that. And Shaitan says to him, you've done nothing. Another one returns to him and says, I did not leave this man alone. Speaking about some Bani Adam. I did not leave this man alone until I separated him from his wife. Shaitan embraces him and he says, you have done well. So if we bear in mind all the time in our marriages that it brings Shaitan utter joy, it is his mission. It is like at the top of his list of ways to destroy Bani Adam, mankind, is to separate a husband and a wife. Be very, very conscious of that. Be very aware of that there is a real force in our dunya that is working against us, that is working against our marriage, okay? Oftentimes, I think when we are in the bitter phases or bitter seasons of our marriages, and we all have them. Marriage is not a perfect, experience. It's got its ebbs and its flows. It's got its chapters, and that's the reality. But it's during the difficult times that we tend to place sole blame on our spouse without realizing that Shaitan has so much to do with it. He has so much to do with the wearing down, the erosion of the relationship between the husband and the wife. And I don't know about you, sisters, but for me, bearing that in mind gives me a little bit of patience with my spouse and with myself and with us as a couple, that this is not only something that every couple goes through, but that it is a trial, a tribulation, and we are being tested, not only individually, but as a couple in our marriage. So we know, again, just to quickly recap that, we know that although divorce is halal in Islam, it is makruh. It is not something that is desirable by our Creator. And so we want to take that a step further and ask ourselves, why might divorce not be something that is desirable? Why is it something on the one hand that is permissible? Allah gives it to us as an option, but it's not something that He encourages us, or He makes it extremely difficult for us to make that final decision. I mean, if you understand the fiqh of divorce, and even though I said I wasn't going to get into this, but just to quickly touch on this, there are so many checks and balances along the way before the actual official divorce. There's a lot of planning that goes into the process. There are a lot of steps and a lot of things that need to be scheduled. It is not an easy matter. That's not to say that many of us Muslims follow those steps to a T, and that is haram. We should be doing that. Okay, we can't pick and choose how and when to follow our deen and the decrees of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's be very, very careful. Okay. So let's talk about divorce outside of the Muslim community and how it has existed over the last, let's say, century here in the United States. In fact, over the last 40 years, unfortunately. About 50% of first marriages end in divorce. And this is a very popular statistic. Most people know this by now. But there was a very important study that was done by two sociologists. One of them was Paul Amato. And in this study, they found that of all the family changes that have occurred during the 20th century, the single most dramatic and far-reaching in its implications on society has been divorce. I mean, think about that for a second. Of all the things that have occurred in society, all the changes and developments and, let's say, progress that have occurred over the last 100 years, the single most dramatic change, the thing that has had the most negative impact on people, has been divorce. That gives us reason to pause and reflect, I think. Now, the increase or the rise in divorce during our lifetime, let's say over the last 40 years, okay, let's say during the 70s, which is when the rate of divorce really spiked. And it may have had something to do with women going out into the workforce, but as we'll see momentarily, there are other more interesting reasons. But the rise in divorce since the 70s has attributed to a handful of reasons for why men and women are choosing that way out. And the one most important reason that came out of this study that I want to focus on, because I see a lot of millennial sisters resorting to this without even realizing it, is the rise in expectations of personal fulfillment in marriage. Another way to put this is the individual wants and desires. And again, I actually, let me clarify. It's not just sisters who are guilty of this. I don't mean to place sole blame on fellow sisters. Our brothers are equally responsible for doing this. But it's the individualistic wants, desires, and needs taking precedence over the needs of our spouses, our children, and our extended family members. It used to be that when divorce occurred, let's say in the 70s, it was very much taboo. There was a lot of stigma around it. And it really only happened when marriages fell apart due to very serious reasons like adultery, abuse, etc. Now, irreconcilable differences is sufficient enough reason for divorce. The courts at one point didn't even allow that as a reason for divorce. And now it's not only allowed, it's very commonplace. It's one of the primary reasons for the dissolution of marriages is irreconcilable differences. We just don't get along, or we're different people, or we don't know how to resolve our conflicts. And that's it. That's reason enough for divorce in the courts. And this is a trend that wasn't necessarily born out of the Muslim community, but it is certainly a trend that is affecting our community, especially 20 to 40-year-old Muslims growing up in the West. And in the same study that I just mentioned that was conducted by Paul Amato, he looked at hundreds of cases of divorce between 1970 and 2000. And what he found was that the effect of divorce on children whose parents divorced in the 70s was high. It decreased in the 80s, and then it increased again in the 90s. So that's interesting. What I looked into, just to kind of fast forward, when I looked into what some of the theories were for this trend, is the takeaway I got from this meta-analysis is that while divorce is more common now than it was in the 70s or before that, and it has less stigma surrounding it, the reasons for divorce and the ease with which couples choose to divorce has a big effect on children. So if in the 70s, it was a new trend, divorce was a new trend, and there was a lot of stigma around it, and single parent homes was a new thing in society, it's understandable that children were very affected by it. By the 80s, that impact had sort of died down, probably due to the fact that the stigma was dying and single parent homes was becoming more normalized. And then in the 90s and up until the 2000s, it spiked again. Well, the biggest change there has been that the reason for getting divorced was no longer adultery necessarily or abuse necessarily, but rather irreconcilable differences or unhappiness on the part of one or both spouses, or one or both spouses want to explore their options. So these sort of individualistic reasons have become the leading cause for divorce. And as Tamara Afifi at UC Santa Barbara explains, today people are getting divorced for personal happiness. She says it point blank. And for children, this is simply not good enough. It's not a good enough reason. Many children are more and more attached to their parents nowadays due to technology than they were in the 70s and 80s and so forth. And when a marriage falls apart simply because one or both couples just wants to explore their options, or they have other personal things that they want to explore, or other goals in life that have nothing to do with their spouse or their children for that matter, that's not a good enough reason for the children, and it leaves a scar on them psychologically. So that moves us into now the impact of divorce on children. According to studies, most children of divorce suffer from poor self-esteem, depression, anxiety, less quality contact with their parents, and their standard of living decreases, if temporarily. And this is probably not very much of a surprise to those of you who are watching. On average, children of divorce end up having less satisfying marriages, and they have less satisfying relationships with their own parents later on in life. These are unfortunately children who are also more likely to get divorced themselves later on in life. So when we consider some of this data and some of this information regarding the impacts of divorce on children, we have to take very seriously the idea of personal fulfillment or personal happiness as a reason enough for a divorce. And yes, this may have been a trend outside of the Muslim community, but more and more it's becoming something that I hear, and I'm sure many of you hear this too, coming out of the mouths of brothers and sisters. There are definitely individuals in my, social circles who, when you sit down with them and you really try to hash out what's going on in their marriages, and they've gotten to the point where they're seeking, a mediator or a trusted source, it's very clear to those of us on the outside that there isn't a Islamically justifiable reason to dissolve the marriage. And in every case, there are children involved, in every case. So we have to really take very seriously the different reasons for why we may be deliberating or contemplating divorce. Now, I want us to also keep in mind that when we're talking about the issue of divorce, we have to have a very clear understanding of the purpose of marriage. You can't talk about divorce without truly understanding the purpose of marriage in Islam. We know that in Islam, marriage is fulfilling half our deen. It has everything to do with developing us and actualizing ourselves as individuals and actualizing society as a whole. Allah knows what's best for us. He knows way more than we know what's best for us. Obviously, He's our creator, subhanAllah. And in this way, when we trust in Allah's wisdom in following His decrees for the purpose of marriage, then we can realize that marriage is a form of ibadah. We are submitting to Him. We submit to Allah's command because in His infinite wisdom, He knows what's best for us individually as well as what's best for us collectively. And Sheikh Yasser Qadi once gave a talk regarding divorce, and I really like the metaphor that he used. He said, divorce is like a fire escape. It's not a front door, but many of us are resorting to it or perceiving it or using it as though it's the front door. It's an option. It's not haram in Islam, so it's just as valid or viable an option as any other option if my marriage is not going well. And so many of us within the 20 to 40 age range have such a hard time processing emotions. We have such a hard time problem solving. We have such a hard time with conflict resolution that when things go awry and when things get really tough, when the going gets tough, the only thing we seem to be able to think about is, well, how do I get out of this? This is really uncomfortable, or this makes me very sad, or this, really is heartbreaking. And I've got to move on from this marriage. The only way to solve this problem is for me to get out of this situation. But let's think about this. You and I are not the only ones who have conflicts in our marriage. There is conflict in every relationship, not just in a marriage, in every friendship and every relationship, be it a colleague and their boss, or, two friends, what have you. There's always going to be conflict. The same way that you don't give up on those relationships and you've got to go in and do your job, you can't give up on your spouse, not when the reasons themselves are not Islamically justifiable. This is what Islam tells us. Now, in contrast, the modern world tells us a very different thing about the purpose of marriage and the shape of marriage. In other words, the pathway into it and out of it. The modern world tells us that marriage is temporary, that we can erase it at any time, that marriage is only truly valuable while love lasts and while both parties find it fulfilling. If at any time one member in the marriage feels unsatisfied, then that's grounds enough for a divorce. And as I've been saying, irreconcilable differences is one of the most, if not the most cited reasons for divorce today. When we do this, when we hop on this bandwagon, this trend of putting our individual happiness above our families and our spouses and the marriage itself, we strip our children of their voices. We render them utterly voiceless and powerless. We render our extended family members voiceless. We render our communities and our greater ummah voiceless. It's a ripple effect, and when this is happening in home after home, it's bound to affect the entire Muslim community and non-Muslim community, our globe, the entire humanity. One thing that I found interesting, and we're still on the issue of how divorce affects children. One thing that was interesting is that in this longitudinal study, they found that the one variable that affects children most after divorce is this: parent conflict. Parent conflict is more important, according to this study, it's more important than divorce per se in predicting how well children can function and recover later on. Based on these 40 years of research, I think it's remarkable that children whose parents have a lot of conflict and who end up staying married, those are the children who have the most difficulty psychologically and who have the most difficulty establishing satisfying marriages later in life. This, to me, points to the rahmah of Allah's decree for us, subhanAllah, that divorce is halal. And it goes back to my question of, well, why is it halal but makruh at the same time? Because data-wise, scientifically speaking, in every other situation, except for the one I just mentioned, divorce has negative impacts on children. The one that does less harm to children than more harm is when a married couple stays married and they have a very high level of conflict. It literally has a physical impact on the children. Conflict has a physical impact on your children. So consider that. Consider the implications of that. If we think of it that way, it makes sense that divorce is a fire escape, that Allah gives it to us as a potential option in serious crises, in serious moments where conflict is truly not able to be rectified, and children themselves are having physical, there's physical damage being done to the children, and perhaps one or more of the spouses as well. So I want to end before the Q&A. I wanted to save a good half an hour. I wanted to end just by cautioning fellow sisters of being very careful in our marriages, and I'm speaking to myself before I speak to anybody else, we want to be careful in our marriages when we find ourselves down, disappointed, or depressed or anxious about how our marriages are going. Many of us have grown up in a society that has set very unrealistic expectations for life in general, not just for marriages, but romantic life for sure. We imagine that after we get married, things are going to be this way and that way, that our husbands are going to be this way and that way. And the same is true on the opposite end. Brothers do the same thing. But I'm speaking to sisters. We have these very unrealistic high hopes and high expectations. And we're bound for disappointment. We are setting ourselves up for sheer disappointment. And then we take out that frustration on our spouses. Why aren't they like this? Why don't they dress like that? Why don't they look this way? Why don't they act that way? Why don't, the list goes on. And that then causes a lot of bitterness and anger and resentment. And when that compounds to such a level that you can't even get along anymore, it's a wonder that divorce ends up becoming an option because you're not happy. How many of us wake up in the morning thinking to ourselves, I'm not happy in this marriage? And maybe your reasons for not being happy are justifiable. Maybe there are serious reasons, like we talked about tonight, where Islamically speaking, it is permissible to seek out a divorce. And again, I'm not giving any specific advice on any particular marriage. I'm speaking generally here. But the vast majority of us, according to this scientific data, the vast majority of us may not be in great marriages. We're in okay marriages. And the impact of getting a divorce much outweighs the impact of fighting through the marriage, allowing the season. We have so much we can learn from our elders, those who've been married for a very long time. Love itself takes on many forms. It has very different, shapes and shades as time goes by and as you mature and you develop in your relationship. That very exciting phase at the beginning, it's like if you've ever driven stick, it's first gear. It's strong, it's immediate, but it runs out quickly. Don't expect it to last. It never does. So think of your marriage as a marathon. Go easy on yourself, go easy on your spouse. Your children are at stake here, and they are an amana from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You will have to answer for that one day. So please keep that in mind. I'll end here. Jazakumullahu khairan. I pray that Allah makes it easier for every single one of us in our marriages. May He purify our hearts and bring us closer to our spouses for our sake and for the sake of our children. May He guide us and shield us from the temptations of the dunya and from the fitnas of our time. Allahumma ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. If there are any questions, please feel free to use the live chat. Sister Deborah, I'm not sure if this is a question, but you said if the kids are grown, why be together in bitterness? Is that a question you want me to address? I don't know if you're still on the call here. But nevertheless, there was a sheikh whose name eludes me now, but I'll see if I can find the video and link it below. He talked about this. He talked about those instances in which a couple is much older, the children are grown, they're married, and they, move on. They have their own families and such. And the couple kind of just doesn't want to be married anymore. And the way he spoke about it was, he said, that's okay, that not every couple is meant to be together forever and never, not everything lasts, that, there is obviously the opportunity in Islam to move on from a marriage. Given my lack of, scholarly education and training, I cannot comment on that. But I will say that in juxtaposition to what this particular sheikh mentions about this topic, there's also data out there that shows the impact of divorce on older children, college age children. And so when I think about those two things, where some children are impacted by divorce, even if they are themselves adults, and others are not, it brings me back again to the point that divorce itself is not the number one variable that hurts the children. It is exactly the conflict between the two parents that hurts the children. So, in instances where the parents have a very difficult time communicating and the children are witnessing a lot of um, negative feelings and negative conflict between the parents, then that is likely to have an impact on them, no matter what their age is. Because think about it, nothing pleases a child more than seeing harmony between the two people that he or she loves the most in life, and that's his mother and his father. So even if you're 25, 35, 45, to see that both parents are at each other's throats is very difficult for a child to cope with. And oftentimes those children are put in the middle, having to decide between both parents. If, on the other hand, this 25, 35, 45-year-old child sees that both parents amicably and respectfully part ways later in life, that will have less of a negative impact on him or her, according to statistical, evidence here. Hmm. Yeah. I mean, cultural differences is certainly grounds for conflict. It can cause conflict. And on the other hand, it doesn't have to. This is why there is no hard and fast rule in Islam about this. There's a process, there's a lot of interpretation that goes into every unique case. And we can't sit here and say, well, if you've got cultural differences and that's cause for conflict, then it must be a done deal and the marriage should, be dissolved. It's more complicated than that. The individuals themselves, and the variance in personalities, the variance in the personalities of the children, in the situation, the socioeconomics, the spirituality, the level of iman, all of those things and more go into helping us figure out if the divorce is actually better off for the family or not. And since it is something that is makruh by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and because we now have the data to back this up, we know that the vast majority of the time, it is going to cause more of a negative impact than a positive impact. And in the one situation, as I mentioned earlier, in the one case where that fact is not true is in the case of severe conflict. I'm not talking about, we all have conflict. We all have conflict, severe conflict, where your children are literally having physical reactions to the conflict between you and your husband. And that isn't really the case in the vast majority of situations today for the reason why people are getting divorced. Okay, you're saying our ummah is intermarrying culturally American converts, marrying foreigners. The Arab problem is a real black eye, and I don't understand his ways, nor he mine, how to mediate differences with alpha males. So I think in situations like this, it's extremely important to seek the support of trusted members in your community who can help to be mediators in the gap that exists in terms of the communication. It's a communication problem. Yes, that is true, but it doesn't always have to be therapists per se. It can be imams, sheikhs, it can be, respected members of the family on both sides. There are ways to go about this, inshallah. And I'm not saying that to in any way downplay the conflict that you're having. It is a real and serious situation that exists for many of us. But if we keep in mind that in Islam we know in a marriage where a couple genuinely, like your intention inside, both parties, Allah will save the marriage. There was somebody once told me when I went through my divorce, the person in the relationship who cares the least has all the power. Think about that for a second. The person in the relationship who cares the least has all the power. I mean, that really stinks. That really sucks. That the person who wants out is going to control the relationship, or the person who is committing a lot of, sins, or is mistreating or stripping the other party of their God-given rights is the one who has power. But keep in the back of your mind that no human being is more powerful than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we bow down and make dua to Allah, when we are victims in our marriages and we are seeking Allah's help, He is not going to forsake us. He will find a way out for us, subhanallah. He will. And it's always a difficult journey, but I just want to say this. I know I'm only 34 years old. That might be old to some of you or young to others, but by Allah's wisdom, I've had some very interesting and traumatic experiences in my life that have included, abandonment and homelessness, to atheism and divorce, etc., etc. And through it all, even though I do not wish to go back and repeat any of those experiences, because my God, were they hard. But alhamdulillah, they made me a much stronger human being, a much wiser human being. And when I say stronger, I don't mean it in the cliche, meme sort of way. I mean stronger in the sense of when conflict comes your way, you don't fear it because you've seen it. Been there, done that. It's almost like you're sticking it to shaitan. Like who do you think you are? I've got Allah on my side. I've been through this and more. There's nothing shaitan can do to you, to your spouse, to your children, in your marriage, if you stick with Rabbna, and I'm saying this as somebody who left the deen for a decade and was completely vulnerable, like being out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, not knowing how to swim. That was my life for 10 years, trying to paddle my way through. And when you come back to Islam, and when you truly, deep down in your heart, believe in the power of dua, your ability to face shaitan, you become formidable. You really do. But I think a lot of us, myself included, we need to take a minute and really think about this. How many of us, apart from knowing this logically, how many of us truly believe deep down inside that when you make dua, Allah is listening? That when you make dua, sincere dua, that dua will be answered. How many of us truly believe that? Or do we make dua because it's kind of like a rote memorization process, or you're going through the motions? Let me take a minute to read what you guys have written. Yeah. So that leads me to another thing that I wanted to say. For some of us, seeking counseling, whether it's premarital, during the marriage, is very, very important. I have no shame in saying this. Before I got married for the second time, I made sure that my husband and I went through a very thorough process of premarital counseling, because I was learning from my mistake the first time around. There are certain things that need to be addressed from the get-go. So for those sisters who are listening who are not married yet, If you walk away remembering one thing, it's this: premarital counseling, Islamic premarital counseling, okay? And that could be with a sheikh, and I recommend shuyukh who are, if not born in the in your, you know, in the US, then at least someone who understands your perspective as an American Muslim, because there are cultural differences there, you know? Um, and if you're in a situation where your spouse doesn't believe in therapy, or, you know, has a difficult time, uh, because they just grew up in a different environment that didn't see that as something real, rather than wasting your energy on trying to convince them that therapy is important, or therapy is a real thing, or depression is a real thing, because you can spend your whole life doing that. I've tried with members in my family. Um, and it's a futile effort. Think outside the box, get creative, like, seek out somebody that you know they will listen to, who you can use as an influencer in your marriage to come in and mediate and knock some sense into the other party. Or I shouldn't say it that way, but to help them see with clarity where you're coming from. You don't always have to go the non-Islamic route of, you know, seeing it as, well, we've got a conflict, we've got to go seek out a professional. Not that I'm against that. I'm an advocate of that. I'm just saying that when you're in a marriage where you have a spouse that comes from a completely different culture, that may not work right away. Maybe it's going to take some time, and you have to find a different avenue in the meantime. Okay, so for Haneen, I want to answer your question by encouraging you to go watch the first video in this series, which is entitled Preparing for Marriage. Yep. Yeah, regarding good guys out there. Remember, sisters, you only need one. You're not out there looking for a pool of good guys. You pray to Allah for one who He knows is the best for you. That's it. That seems so much more manageable. I don't know, in my mind. And the fact that I trust that I can give that task to my creator and I don't have to stress about it, alhamdulillah. If you have not watched that first video, I talk about this. I talk about this exact thing. So I want to just encourage you to watch that video. It's called Preparing for Marriage. And I can, while you guys are chatting, I'll see if I can pull up the direct link to that. Inshallah, the next and final live stream connected to this mini series is going to be about life after the honeymoon phase. And we'll be covering some similar aspects to what we've already talked about, but there will also be some new content as well. And if you have any questions ahead of time that you would like me to answer in that third video, then go ahead and shoot me a message on my website. My website is noormgoda.com. And if you just fill out the contact form, you can privately leave your question. And inshallah, I'll try to incorporate that in the conversation. How do you see extroverts marrying introverts? Lena, I want to encourage you to pick up 2 books. The first one is called Silent. It's a bestseller, and it has to do with the power of introverts. And the other one is called The Introvert Advantage. It is, it gives us some more insight into how introverts really function and what they're really like. I personally don't think that an introvert and an extrovert getting married is going to be a necessary source of conflict. It can be. It is not like a golden rule or anything like that. There are plenty of relationships where introverts and extroverts come together. My my father-in-law actually was married for 40 something years before his wife passed away. One of them was an introvert, one of them was an extrovert, but they had an understanding with each other and they gave each other space to pursue their personal interests and hobbies. And that's the other thing I want to say is maybe we'll do a mini series on just like tips for marriage. If you're spending too much time with your spouse, in my opinion, this is my unsolicited advice here. If you're spending too much time with your spouse, stop. Just stop. I mean, if you spend too much time with any one person, period, then you're bound to like get bored of them. You're bound to start getting irritated with them. And I know during the quarantine, it's very challenging. I get that. And that's not to say that, something is wrong with you or your spouse. It's just, you need a balance. Life is all about balance. You need time to pursue your own hobbies and interests and do your own thing. He needs that time as well. And there should be, times in your relationship that are scheduled and times that are not scheduled so that you can catch up on things, so that things can stay exciting and interesting. But if you're like constantly communicating or you rely solely on your spouse to be your source of therapy, love, financial security, if your husband does it all for you, or if you do it all for him, unless you guys are both okay with that, that can be a source of conflict. It really can. It is a roller coaster, yes. Absolutely. Young couples want their spouse to be their best friend. Yep, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. You mentioned a very good point there, Halima, that, I mean, take a look at older couples. You notice how they can sit together for hours and not say a word to each other? And I'm talking about people who've been married for like decades. It's not because they don't love each other necessarily. It's not because they want a divorce. It's because their love has gone through the phases and the seasons, and it's in a stage now where there is an understanding between them. They respect and love each other so much that without having to have that conversation, they've learned to give each other that space that is needed so that their relationship, yes, it's a friendship, exactly, so that their relationship can thrive always. I oftentimes ask my husband to tell me stories about his parents' marriage because they seem to have a very good one. And oftentimes, his mother would be reading on her own and his father liked to be outdoors exploring and doing things. And he traveled a lot. And his mother wasn't really interested in those things. But when I sit down with my father-in-law, I hear nothing but amazing things. She was my best friend, and he gets teary-eyed about it. She was my best friend. And I knew the very first moment I saw her that she was the one. And, just the sweetest things. I could go on and on. And then when you hear about how he stood by her side during her last few years as she was deteriorating right before she passed away, the way he sacrificed everything, to be her caretaker, it's like today, you could easily find a sister or a brother complaining that their spouse doesn't want to travel with them, that their spouse doesn't have the same interests as them, and that therefore they're going to look outside of their marriage for somebody who's going to share those interests with them. It's absurd, in my opinion. It is really, really absurd. Deborah, you need a maid. It's very terrifying. It's very terrifying how quickly we give up on our spouses, how quick we are to think about our needs and how our needs are not being fulfilled. And it goes back to this individualistic, trend, which I swore I wasn't going to get into the history of it, and I'm not. But yeah, exactly. It's grounds for divorce that your individual needs are not being met and you want to be happy and you're not happy. And so you need to go out and seek happiness. The grass is not greener on the other side. The same problems that you experienced in this marriage, you're going to find in the next marriage. And actually the statistics are staggering. 50% of first marriages end in divorce. even more. I think it's close to like 70 or something. And close to 70% of second marriages end in divorce. So the rate of success in marriages does not increase the number of times that we get married. Keep that in the backs of your minds. And I will say that many of us don't actually learn from our mistakes the first time around. We don't actually take responsibility for why the marriage went awry. Oftentimes, it's blaming the other person, blaming the circumstances, blaming the conditions, blaming every single thing except for looking at ourselves. And if that's the way that we're going to be about it, then we're bound to make the same mistakes all over again. Brothers and sisters, we're going to do the same thing again. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, mashallah, you're all saying such important and interesting things. Yeah. That's really funny. I did say I was going to pull up the link to the first video and then I got sidetracked. So let me go and do that while you guys are chatting. Anissa, regarding a video about the history, go and watch my video on feminism and identity politics. It's a long video, but it's hopefully as thorough as you'll need it to be. And I can link that here for you as well. So the link I just sent is the link to the first video in this series about preparing for marriage. It's really short. It's only 30 minutes long, which is rare for me, but alhamdulillah, I did it that one time. Okay, we're about 3 minutes away from the end. So are there any other questions? I really hope that you'll join me for the next one next time. And that's going to be on June 12th, same time, same place. And if there are other topics that you would like me to cover, then as always, you can reach me through the contact form on my website. Your feedback is always helpful to me. If there are topics that you ask for that I don't cover, it's because I don't feel like I'm in a position to speak about it, but so it doesn't mean that I'm ignoring you. And I truly appreciate the online community that's been developing over the last few months. May Allah reward each and every one of you. Aisha, you had one more question. What would you advise young couples today who are struggling in their marriages but don't want professional help? I first and foremost learn your deen, learn what your deen tells you about conflict in marriages, because our deen is a blueprint. You know, it tells us what we need to know about our rights and our responsibilities. Many times these conflicts, Aisha, they happen because spouses don't know their rights and responsibilities. I mean, you would be surprised. You would be so surprised that if they just got their affairs in order, if the men were doing what they're supposed to do, the women are doing what they're supposed to do according to the Quran and the Sunnah, a lot of these problems would just like evaporate, because Allah gave us the prescription. You know, we just need to follow through. But it's like we're banging our heads up against the wall, like, you know, I'm making dua, I'm praying my prayers, and I'm doing all this stuff. And it's like, yeah, but you're not fulfilling your duty as a husband, and you're not fulfilling your duty as a wife. So, you know, I shouldn't be, you know, sarcastic about it. I don't mean to be, you know, condescending in any way, but let's get serious. Let's get serious here. We don't need to look a million and one other places. The answer has been in front of us for over 1400 years. Just take some responsibility, learn your deen, follow through, and take it from there. There you go. There you go. Okay, ikhwati. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. See you next time, inshallah.